I think by and large, a lot of it, and this is true, I think, with any person who's going through a traumatic experience, but I think particularly with kids, a lot of it depends on how strong the support system is.
Okay.
So like, as I was saying before, like a lot of it really depends on the environment. Mm-hmm. So you can have a kid who's going through a terrible situation at home, but they have one Rebbe, or they have one teacher, they have one Mora who like notices that they're having a tough time and notices it, gives them the space, gives them a place where they can feel safe, even if it's just for a little bit.
Right.
Then that could be something which could be tremendous for them.
Domestic abuse. What is it? How do the pressures in our community contribute to sweeping it under the rug? How does domestic abuse affect our children? How can we help our children who maybe have experienced domestic abuse? How can we build a support around our children if we ourselves are experiencing it? Welcome back to another episode of the Jews Next Door, where we will be talking to Yeshaya Kraus, who is the Director of Education for Shalom Task Force, whose whole mission it is to prevent and to address and to help the Jewish community to really reduce the amount of domestic violence. And Yeshaya Kraus, being the Director of Education, who gives so many parent workshops and workshops to students all about this topic, is the perfect person to take us through these questions and so much more. There is so much to learn about this topic, and I'm so excited to share it with you. Without further ado, enjoy the episode. Okay, this week we have the privilege of talking to Yeshaya Kraus, who is the Director of Education for Shalom Task Force. And really a special thank you to you for taking the time. It's funny, when we were going back and forth in terms of like the podcast, the episode, and I sent you the questions, and you sent back to me, you're like, just want to clarify that, Shalom Task Force is really more dealing with domestic abuse. And I think I had this original assumption, which I think might not be so uncommon, that, abuse is, mostly maybe child abuse. And I was so happy that you clarified, because we'll have a very different type of a conversation.
Yes,
but it was so interesting to me. And I'm starting it off this conversation with that because it's somewhat in a way wonder, what does that say a little bit about the misconceptions? So it's just, and I guess we're going right in there, but just first of all, really a big thank you to you, really, Director of Education for Shalom Task Force, the leaders of our door in this area, speaking about raising the Jews next door. So really, thank you again.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me on. This is one of the fun parts of the job. It's a very interesting observation that you're making, and I have come across that before, where like for example, there was somebody who had reached out to me about a month ago or something, and he was like arranging some sort of a convention focusing specifically on child abuse in Jewish circles. Mm-hmm. And I said, listen, I'm happy to brainstorm, but it's not really our circle. But I think
so interesting.
I don't think it's an uncommon misconception. I mean, generally speaking, I think this is true with anything, but like when we'll hear a term and we'll automatically connect it to the things that are most familiar with us. Yeah. I think it's great that child abuse gets so much attention, and I think that the fact that it does get so much attention is probably a part of what makes people think like, oh, abuse must be that they deal with child abuse. So I would say that it makes a lot of sense. I think domestic violence possibly is a much less comfortable thing to talk about.
Interesting.
It's like domestic violence is like, you think about it, it's like with child abuse, it's like there's a very obvious victim. It's like, there's a child, there's a defenseless child, there's somebody who like really can't fend for themselves, and the people who potentially are supposed to be the ones who are protecting them are, chas v'shalom, they're the ones who are actually victimizing them. Whereas many times when people look at a marriage, they look at a couple, and there are so many questions about like, oh, well, what did that person do to provoke the victimization, whatever it is that's happening. Right. So it's like, it's not as clear cut, and I'm sure we'll get to this as through our conversation today, but it raises a lot of very uncomfortable questions about marriages, about many assumptions that we have about abuse. So it's like, I think that tends to be where people tend to go.
So interesting. Yeah. So I guess let's start with, what are the stats? What are the, statistics of, I guess, the various forms, but I guess really more domestic abuse in general? But I guess let's get more specific, the Jewish community. And then specifically, I'm curious if it's different in the Orthodox community?
So let's start with some very general stats. I mean, if you look at the CDC, and I'm going to give you some basic definitions of exactly what domestic abuse covers.
Okay.
As I answer this, just so we can have kind of a frame of reference to understand it. The one I think that most people know about is physical violence. There's physical abuse, which is pretty much straight up obvious. It's actually really pretty much how the organization got started. About 30 years ago, there was a doctor in the 5 towns who saw that people were coming in with bruises that just didn't make sense.
Really?
Yeah.
That was how it got started?
Yeah.
Holy cow.
So,
wow.
He's seeing like women and children just coming in and just
wow.
it just didn't make sense. He did some digging. He realized that this was there was domestic violence that was happening.
Wow.
So he got together some community leaders. They started it up, and 30 years later, this is where we are.
Wow.
But I think that's obviously the most obvious one because you can actually see it.
Right.
On the side, there's emotional abuse, there's verbal abuse, sexual abuse, financial abuse, like all sorts of different things, and basically. Right. Any part of a person's life in which they should have some degree of autonomy, self-direction, agency, or even the right to have an opinion is one which can be grounds potentially for abuse. Mm-hmm. So I'll just give you the CDC has come out with numbers, and they do this pretty frequently. I think the last numbers that I know of are from 2018. Mm-hmm. So I'll give you their numbers with a few caveats. 1 out of 4 women will experience over the course of her lifetime a physically violent relationship.
1 out of 4.
Yeah. And 1 out of 7 men will experience a physically violent relationship.
Those are some crazy numbers.
It is. And
that's alarming.
It is alarming.
If you think about it, just like that really could potentially mean that 1 out of 4 people on your block, not really, it could be. Theoretically. And that's just like a crazy way to like think about it. Wow, that's crazy. Yeah. Okay.
So now for the caveats.
Right.
So number 1, this is only talking about physical violence. Those numbers
don't
include emotional, verbal, financial, sexual, etc. They don't include those other numbers. Those are specifically for physical.
Do they have numbers on those, or there's no way to really?
I don't know the numbers. I'm sure that they have numbers in some way, shape, or form.
Would you think that it's higher or less?
I would say that it's probably somewhat higher.
Wow.
I'd also want to say that the numbers that are given for those were done on a mainstream American sample. And if you think about that, so most of the people who are in this sample are going to have gone through a couple of relationships over the course of their lifetime.
Sure.
Potentially several. And they're saying that out of those people, you get those numbers of 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 7. So those numbers don't specifically speak to the frum world. That being said, again, it's only physical violence that those numbers really describe. So there could be any number of different kinds of violence that are happening, even in the frum world.
Sure.
I can give you the numbers. We have Shalom Task Force has our hotline, which people can call into and anonymously talk about whatever concerns that they have.
Right.
I will tell you, we don't have specific statistics. I don't think we've done any serious studies for 1 out of 4, 1 out of 5, whatever it is.
Sure.
But we have over the past since the beginning of the hotline, I think close to 30 years ago, we've had 26,000 calls.
26,000
plus. Wow. 26,000 plus. So
wow,
these
it's
a number.
That's a number.
It's a big number.
That's a number.
So these are people who are either calling in for themselves, they are calling in for their friends, their families. They're calling in.
Really, you have people calling in about other people that they're witnessing.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
We have people calling in about friends, about family members.
Family is not. I'm not as surprised by it, but friends. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
We've had people saying, "Listen, I see my friend is going through this. What can I do to help?
Interesting.
Is there anything I can do to help?"
Wow.
We've had people saying that I've reached out to this person, that person who I thought would help, and they weren't able to.
Wow.
But we get calls, and you get it from pretty much every different stripe in the Jewish community. We get calls from the Hasidim, we get calls from modern Orthodox, and from the Yeshivish, from the Balabatish, whatever sociological label you want to put on it, we get calls from them.
Gotcha.
So this is an issue which is it's not, and if you look at different communities also, it's like it's not something which any one community or any one ethnicity or culture has a monopoly on. This is something that it's a human issue.
Right.
Basically in any relationship, you think about it in any relationship, there's going to be the potential. There is a power balance. Then there's a balance of control, and abuse of that balance is where domestic abuse comes from.
Got it. So what? Let's just take a step back for a second. What is the definition of it? Meaning, because you just said any abuse of that balance. Does that mean that someone who says, I don't want to do that? Is that like I don't want to, I don't know, wash the dishes tonight? Is that one? I mean, I know it's like a silly example, but I'm curious, like what's your definition then of abuse?
So the abusive definition that we use is a pattern of behaviors which are meant to take power and control through intimidation, through the instilling of fear.
So like if someone would say, you better wash the dishes tonight, that's getting either is abuse or getting close to abuse, or?
So it depends on context. Like it always, like this is the therapist cheat sheet answer. It always depends. It always depends on context. And it depends on whatever else is going on in the relationship. But yeah, if you're saying you have to do this, you do not have a choice, and you're removing the other person's ability to make decisions or to voice their opinions, and you are using whatever power you have in the situation to enforce a certain thing without any regard for what the other person wants,
right?
Then yeah, that's abuse.
Got it. So would you say that the numbers, going back to the numbers we were just talking about, would you say that the numbers are different in the Orthodox community?
It's very hard to say. I don't think that they are significantly different.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, and again, with all those caveats that we had mentioned, but I don't, because again, it's a human issue.
Right.
And like.
Right. I guess I'm hoping the answer would be, yes, they're different. They're less because, as we should, I would hope that we'd be more, with the Torah being led by the Torah to be more ethical and moral, it'd be less in it. But if you're saying not that, I mean, it's sad. It's sad to hear that.
It's sad, and it's kind of scary, honestly.
Yeah.
Like, there's a famous story. I always get mixed up with who the story is about. There's a famous story of a Rosh Yeshiva in Europe. I think it was Rav Chaim Volozhin, but I could be wrong on that. Where somebody asked him a shaila about his son he had some mental issues. He had some mental illness issues, and at that point, the way you dealt with those things, you sent them away to like some mental home of some sort. And they did whatever treatments that they did over there, and hopefully they came out on the other side somewhat in better shape than they were when they started out. Right. So the person's shaila was that the only place that's available doesn't have kosher food. So should I send him?
Right.
And the answer that he got was, first you have to make him into a mensch, then you make him into a yid. So when we say that this is a human issue, it's like certainly a person can learn and a person can do all these things, but that basic foundation of menschlichkeit has to be there first. And it's a very hard thing to wrap your mind around. It's like, there are definitely stories about people who, and this is actually not uncommon among people who abuse their spouses, but they may present a very polished, charming public face, and at home it's a completely different person.
Well, yeah, I feel like that's that's pretty normal. No, you're not going to usually see it so much.
Right.
I mean, is that right? Is that true? Or?
You can see it sometimes. You can see it more like if you're like paying attention to it, like really paying attention. But more often than not, there's a very polished public face that people will wear outside, and when they go home, it's a completely different story.
Right.
That's where the power dynamic comes into play.
Right.
That's where the abusive dynamic comes into play. Right. So it can be very, very different.
Got it. So let's get into it. Shalom Task Force provides workshops, provides different trainings to deal with literally all of this. What does that look like? What do the workshops look like? What's the goals of the workshops? How do they accomplish those goals?
Okay, make yourself comfortable.
Here we go.
So for the longest time, I think the hallmark of our education departments has been the high school workshops that we run.
Okay.
So for a good long time, we've been doing senior workshops in girls' schools and boys' schools. And what those work, we actually recently redid like the basics of the workshop, just like, how the flow of it and like some of the specific presentations of it. But overall, the goal of these workshops is a few goals. Number one is to start a conversation. Mm-hmm. Like we go into these places and we're talking to kids who, regardless of where you are, like which stripe of Judaism you fall into, people in 12th grade are thinking about marriage. They're thinking about relationships. It's something that's on their mind. And they're also kind of savvy. These people, the kids in 12th grade, they're pretty savvy. They know what's going on. They know that relationships are not just a walk in the park. Right. So they're already thinking like, okay, well, what could go wrong? What could go right? They're thinking about these things, but they don't often have people to have conversations with these things with. They feel uncomfortable having these kinds of conversations with people because it's like, not everybody wants to talk about these things.
Mm-hmm. If you're looking for a great way to have some good, clean, kosher fun with your children through the powerful effect of music, look no further because J Karaoke is here. J Karaoke gives one and all the platform to belt out their favorite tunes from a library of thousands of Jewish songs, hundreds of artists and genres across multiple decades of incredible Jewish music. Personally, I know that I love singing. I love it. I love karaoke, but I was really never able to get into it because it wasn't the Jewish songs. And that's where J Karaoke comes in with their huge selection from the latest hits to the classics. They even have nursery rhymes for your little ones. And with features like key changes to help you sing, to make you more comfortable as you're singing, and speeding it up or slowing down the song, they have really thought of everything. To enjoy Jewish karaoke your way, all you need to do is head to jkaraoke.com. Choose a subscription that fits for you. And to make it even more fun, you could purchase their state-of-art karaoke kit, which gives you the feeling as if you are today's top singer. You can insert whoever you feel it is. Connect your kit to any device, like it could be a laptop, a computer, a tablet, whatever it is, and you plug in your speaker, plug in your J Karaoke microphone, and you sing away. It's as easy as that. That's all it is, and it's really fun. I checked out their website. It really looks amazing. They have an incredible amount of song selection. Anything you want. They got Thank You Hashem. They got Mordechai Shapiro. They really got it all. You can subscribe monthly for just $4.99 a month, yearly for $49.99, and we have a special deal here for you. For any of our listeners, if you use the code Jews Next Door, DOR, you get an additional 10% off. And if you don't want your children to be using a device with internet, J Karaoke's got you covered. You can download the app onto your desktop. Once you have it up, turn off the internet, let them sing all day long without the internet. Check out J Karaoke today and let the fun begin.
So what these workshops do is, number one, it gives them a space to participate in a conversation like that. And we try to make these workshops as interactive as possible, obviously within reason. But we talk to them about what healthy relationships look like. What does an unhealthy relationship look like? What does an abusive relationship look like? And they're different. Yeah. An abusive relationship, as we said, is that power and control dynamic. Unhealthy is more, if you had to encapsulate it into one word, it would just be disconnected.
What do you mean by that? What's the word disconnected mean for you there?
Well, let's talk about it in terms of what a healthy relationship is, and then the flip side would be the unhealthy. A healthy relationship is where you have a sense of commitment, you have a sense of trust, you have a sense of mutuality. There's a certain sense of responsibility to each other. When there's a problem, the two people will turn towards each other with that problem, and they'll be able to openly communicate about it. And in a less healthy relationship or an unhealthy relationship, more often than not, there's going to be turning away from each other when there's a problem. There's going to be really not much effective communication about whatever's going on. And just the nature of the connection is going to be much different than might be in a much healthier relationship. And it's a spectrum. It's a spectrum. Most people fall in somewhere in the middle. Everybody's got their ups and downs. Everybody's got their parts, or hopefully everybody's got their parts where they do pretty good work. And everybody's got stuff that they need to work on, but that's normal. That's a perfectly regular, common thing for people to have. Where there are some areas in their relationships where they're just not so thrilled, and they work on it. And hopefully, and our goal is to be in relationships which are healthy enough. Right.
So you're saying the goal of the high school workshops is to give them those definitions, get the conversation going, to give them a little bit of a guidance as they start to get used to thinking about that. Okay.
So that's a part of it. And then we also talk more about what domestic abuse is. We talk about different examples of it. We talk about what it might look like. Talk about red flags. Red flags are very important.
Yeah.
Like just understanding that everybody who has who wants to be in a relationship has a right to expect that you'll be respected, that there's a sense of trust and of honesty and of openness and safety in a relationship. And like safety, that's the basis of everything. If you don't have safety, then nothing else is going to fly.
Right.
So we talk about all those things. We talk about the idea of acknowledging the feelings that you have for what they are, trusting them. Like the reason Hashem created emotions for a reason. You know, and if you get into like the whole neurology of it, it's fascinating how emotions work. Here, let's give you an example. Let's say all of a sudden a lion just crashes down through the ceiling and sitting on the couch over there. It's like snarling and freaking out. So your brain, or you're getting the emotional feeling of panic way faster than you're registering in your mind that there's a lion on that couch and it's probably going to do something nasty.
Interesting.
The emotions react way faster.
Right.
So Hashem built those into us.
So that way we can react to things.
Exactly.
Right.
So we can react, and that we can interact with our environment to it. We can interpret different parts of our experience. So they're there for a reason. Now, what very often happens, and I think specifically when we're talking about relationships, there's so much pressure to, you know, especially for like, you know, from Yiddishkeit is by and large, is a very family-oriented culture. It is. There's a lot of pressure to get married. There's a lot of pressure to have kids. There's a lot of pressure to put on a public face and to keep it together. You know, to just make sure that everything is in order and that you look good and that, you know, you're presenting well.
Especially in the Instagram generation that we're in.
Yes, very much so.
It's got to be picture perfect.
Yes, don't get me started. That's a whole other soapbox. But it's very simple for people who are going into relationships or even approaching relationships or accidentally falling into relationships, even if they're not doing it intentionally, to take their feelings and stuff them under the rug.
Right.
Take certain feelings, the uncomfortable feelings that we might have, and say,
because of the fact that they feel like it needs to be picture perfect? Is that where
Partially, whether it's because of picture perfect, social pressure, family pressure.
I wonder if like that has been heightened in a way by the rise of social media.
It's an interesting question. I wouldn't be surprised if that were true.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be, I mean, there's definitely enough putting pressure on people even without social media, that's for sure. But I would not be surprised at all if that would if that would be shown to be a significant factor.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. And then there's also, there's religious factors also.
Sure.
You know, you think about it, there's the mandate, you know, you're supposed to get married, which is great. You know, it's very nice. But at the same time, you have to be able to make decisions which make sense.
Right.
You have to be able to make decisions which are safe and which make sense at your own speed. You know, actually part of the way that the education department got started was slightly after we had started the hotline. This is before my time, so it's technically not we. But we were getting a bunch of calls on the hotline from people who were saying like, yeah, I'm married for however long, and I wish somebody had told me that this thing that I was seeing when we were dating was a problem.
Wow.
I wish somebody had told me it's okay to trust the fact that you're nervous.
Interesting.
And people, and it was a lot of people calling with just basically that same message.
Wow.
That we need, that I had those feelings, I noticed it, and I said, don't worry about it, it'll be fine. So that's a big part of what the education department is trying to do. We want to, aside from that idea of opening up the conversations, and we want to also plant seeds that
listen to your emotions.
Yeah. Listen to yourself. Think about what you're doing. Pay attention to yourself. Yeah. Like this is something I've told clients before. You are going to be with yourself 24/7 for the rest of your life.
Right.
You know, and you're the one who knows yourself the best. You are the only one who can really take responsibility for yourself.
Right.
And to give people the license to do that, to give people the permission almost to do that, is a very empowering thing.
Right. I don't remember where I heard this, but I once heard someone say that whenever you're hearing something or whenever you have a decision, the first feeling that you have is really like, you know, in the heart of hearts, like that's really what you should go with, because that's what's good for you. Sometimes people, like you saying, is people will ignore it or say maybe let me analyze it a little bit, and then they'll talk themselves out of it. But the first feeling, like whatever you got a heavier feeling about, that's really what you should follow.
Yeah, I remember getting that advice when I was taking the SATs. Actually, so first answer that you like, that's the one you go with.
That's funny.
But it's very true. It's there's the idea of mitzvah bal liadcha al tach mitzena, right? Don't let it ferment. And it's the same idea. Like you have your gut reaction, and then like all of a sudden, all these other rationalizations and thoughts and ideas come popping into your head, and they start like making you doubt and making you think more about why it might not be. And there are all these different considerations.
And like
that
you said,
have.
the pressure of feeling like I want to get married, so maybe this is the right person, it'll work, it'll be fine, and then which might be.
We're not saying like, if you have a nervous feeling, that's it, break it off, go live in a cave.
Correct.
But the idea is to respect it, to acknowledge the feeling, and also to talk it over with somebody whose guidance you value. That's a big part of it. And beyond that, the third goal, I think, really of the high school workshops is to give the students a vocabulary to talk about these things.
Right. Just they have the language that they, like when they recognize things or whatever it is.
Got it. Exactly. Like we give out after these things, we give out these survey papers. Notoriously, girls end up answering them more fully than the boys do. Not surprising to anybody.
Nope.
But there are a few themes to what we often see. And one of those themes is, thank you for coming down. Nobody ever talks to us about this stuff.
Wow.
One of those themes is, I always knew that sometimes, unfortunately, there are students in the audience who maybe are witnessing these kinds of things. Yeah. And they say, I never knew what to call what I was seeing. Really? And now I see it, and now I know what it is.
It gives them the ability to language it. Wow, to label it. Wow.
Yeah, to label it and to identify it and to understand it. And part of having words to talk about these things. And I think that this is true with really any mental health oriented or emotional challenge that anybody faces. You give people the words to talk about things, and they'll be able to, not only will they be able to describe it, they'll be able to understand it, and they'll be able to manage it much more effectively. If I know what I'm dealing with and I can describe it to somebody else, then all of a sudden it's not this insurmountable monster that just kind of like lives under the couch and just like, eats me. Right. It's something that it has a name. It's something real.
And now I can figure out what's the next steps. Right.
And just on top of that, even the idea that there's a word for something like this, the idea that there's a name for it, makes it that like, okay, other people know about this. It's not so isolating. Sure. So it's still scary, but it's something that I can talk about now. It's something that I have permission to talk about now, which is very powerful. Yeah. So that's really what we do in high school workshops. Got it. And aside from that, I mean, we've done trainings for therapists who are dealing with domestic violence in their practices. Got it. We've done trainings for rabbanim. Which is, I think this is an incredibly important thing, like for the communal first responders. Sure. Very often rabbanim are the first people who are approached. Yeah. Especially in our communities where we value hashkafas hatayra, we value how rabbanim think, and it's so important for rabbanim to know their way around these issues. Right. It's unfortunate, but you can have very well-meaning people who unwittingly do more damage than is already being done by not knowing the ins and outs of it. Like one very surprising thing that comes up with groups of rabbanim that I've spoken to. One very surprising thing makes everybody think about it a second time, but is that when you have a couple that has an abusive dynamic, do not refer to couples therapy. Not referring to couples therapy because, and there are a couple of reasons for this. One is because
they need to be separated.
So not even that they need to be separated specifically, but just the whole idea of what couples therapy is about is increasing communication, increasing vulnerability. You're saying if they're
interesting. Trying to if there's an abusive nature to this, then to increase the vulnerability would just backfire and maybe even worsen it.
Right. Exactly.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Worse. And on top of that,
but you wouldn't think that in that therapy it would like either come out or be able to be tackled, or you're saying like, no, don't rely on that.
So it gets into the whole idea of what makes abusers abuse, which is like a whole discussion.
Whole everything, a whole different podcast in itself.
It could be. It could be. I would listen to it. But by and large, the best way to address an abusive relationship, at least in terms of from a therapeutic aspect, from a clinical aspect, is that each person should have their own therapy. Mm-hmm. and work on whatever it is that they need to work on. And then if the decision is that they want to that they want to remain together and they want to keep the marriage going, then once the therapists are confident
in both
that
of them,
it's safe,
right,
then maybe to start doing couples counseling.
Interesting.
Maybe.
Wow.
But it's a very delicate thing to do.
It's fascinating.
Very delicate thing. But that's always very surprising to people.
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
like, no, don't send them.
It makes a lot of sense when you explain it. It's just like,
right?
wow, that's fascinating.
This is not shalom bias that we're talking about.
Right.
This is abuse,
Yeah,
and it's a completely
totally
different
thing. Right.
One of my favorite verlach, very interesting thing, in Birchas Kriyas Shema, right? So the first bracha starts off, Aisa Shalom V'Verias Hakol, right? So the question is asked. The Achros L'Shalom asks this question. He says, why does it have to be Aisa Shalom and then V'Verias Hakol? It's like, well, Hashem could have just like snap, boom, everything's there. So he says that when Hashem created the world, he used the four elements, the earth, wind, water, fire, those four elements to create everything.
Right.
Now, try creating something of fire and water together. You're not going to get very far. They're going to cancel each other out.
Right.
So the creation of Shalom is such that it allows two seemingly contradictory things to coexist and create something
it's like
larger.
like what it says by the Makkah, that by the Barad.
Yes.
That they made it was Shalom. They made Shalom to be able to coexist. Right?
Exactly. So that's the concept of Shalom. The concept of Shalom is two contradictory things which are occupying the same space and building something greater.
Got it.
So when we talk about Shalom bias, that's what it is. You have a man and a woman who are contradictory things. We're opposite parts of whatever it is, psychologically, physically, whatever. We're different, and we are able to coexist without canceling each other out. That's what Shalom bias is.
Interesting.
Shalom bias is not that you have one party which is completely overtaking the other one and canceling it out.
Right.
That's the absence of Shalom. So when we talk about abuse and Shalom bias are two completely different things.
Sure.
But it's a major misconception.
This is part of, this topic of child safety. And it's interesting, some people might be listening so far and being like, wait, so what does this have to do with child safety? So I'm curious, what are the effects of domestic violence on children who witness this going on in their home?
That is a very, very good question. There are a lot of different effects potentially, and a lot of it, as I said, there's the cheat answers. It depends. A lot of it really depends on what the larger environment that the child finds himself in it might be.
What do you mean by that?
So let's say you have, God forbid, you have a child whose parents are abusive towards each other, or one is abusive towards the other. So what are they learning from that? What they're picking up from that is that the model of a marriage is that there's abuse, there's this misuse of the power dynamic that exists within the relationship.
Right.
The more you think about it, the deeper it goes. They're learning a misconception of what gender roles might be.
Oh, interesting.
Without even understanding that there is a concept of abuse. If what they're seeing is that the father is physically abusive towards the mother, the conception is that, okay, well, that's the father's role is to do that.
That's just how it works.
That's just how it works. Exactly. Which is actually so there's somebody who's actually done a lot of work with abusive men, and he said that his name is Lundy Bancroft. He wrote a book, I believe, called Why Does He Do That? And one of the things that he talks about is that all the abusive people that he's worked with all have this common theme, that they feel that it's their right to act the way they act. They feel that it's just their right. That's just how things are supposed to be.
Interesting. Does that mean that it's coming from them, they're potentially being in an abusive environment when they were growing up, so they got that notion?
And there's that possibility.
Right.
There's
not always.
Not always, but that's definitely a possibility, a part of where it came from.
Right.
You think about what other impacts it might have. Some traumatic reactions. Right, traumatic reactions to in relationships. You can have inability to, less willingness to be open and vulnerable in relationships. With friendships, you can have a person being emotionally withdrawn.
Right.
I think on a more immediate scale, if somebody's living in an environment where abuse is rampant, there's going to be poor social interactions. You're going to have
because of the fact that they're going to get used to acting in a way that Or not? It can go both ways. You're saying.
Either because they're acting in a way which is aggressive towards others, or potentially because they're pulling into themselves
because they're not sure if people are going to act towards that. Right. Interesting.
It could go either way. Mm-hmm. Academically, they're likely not going to, either they're not going to do well, or they're going to be so afraid of not doing well, they're going to push themselves to excel.
Interesting.
So like you can have all sorts of different presentations going on with a child.
So what can they do? I guess number one is, how can children recover after witnessing it? Right. And then is there something that, parents can do to help their children recover? And I guess to add a third caveat to the question, is there a difference between, let's say, when we're talking about emotional abuse or versus physical abuse, meaning in terms of like the ways to recover?
So it's an interesting question. I'm not aware of any particular differences between emotional abuse and physical abuse.
You're saying in terms of the recovery?
Right. I mean, I think by and large, a lot of it, and this is true, I think, with any person who's going through a traumatic experience, but I think particularly with kids, a lot of it depends on how strong the support system is.
Okay.
So like, as I was saying before, like a lot of it really depends on the environment. Mm-hmm. So you can have a kid who's going through a terrible situation at home, but they have one Rebbe, or they have one teacher, they have one Mora who like notices that they're having a tough time and notices it, gives them the space, gives them a place where they can feel safe, even if it's just for a little bit,
right.
Then that could be something which could be tremendous for them in terms of being able to both navigate it and potentially do whatever recovery they need to do.
Got it.
Having a space to process the feelings that come along with that, having somewhere that they can actually learn whatever skills that they need that they may not have had an opportunity to learn at home. Things like that. So a lot of it really depends on what kind of support system they have, either in the moment as they're experiencing it, or further down the line. As I said, like a lot of times people will answer on those surveys that we give towards at the end of the workshops, and they'll say like, I feel much better now knowing that I can make choices in my relationships instead of just kind of resigning myself to, okay, this is the way they are.
Wow.
So knowing about what it is, being able to identify it, is also a big part of it.
Yeah.
So that makes a huge difference for people.
Just like what we were saying, like being able to label it and then saying like, okay, like you said, it's not like some scary monster, I don't know what's going on. Being able to like say, okay, I know what it is, and now I can know how to deal with it.
Right. Being able to contextualize it.
Right.
That's really, that's a huge thing for people.
For sure. So what would you say? So you're saying the way for them to recover from witnessing it is really going to depend on having some sort of support system.
Yeah, there's support system is always necessary. I mean, like,
are there other things that can be done?
I mean, there are a lot of different parts to what that support system might look like. The support system could be a therapist, it could be a teacher, it could be the parent who's going through their own recovery process. Mm-hmm. Being able to give them whatever support they can from whatever point they're at. So there are a lot of different aspects to what that might look like.
Got it. Have you seen from your experience that any home that has domestic abuse going, let's say from one spouse to another spouse, often leads to the transfer, let's say from a spouse doing it to a spouse doing it to the child as well?
So I haven't seen it personally.
Okay.
But it is, so the idea is power and control. Then essentially anybody who's going to challenge...
That's what I would assume, right. That's why I'm wondering.
Anybody who's going to challenge that is going to be looked at as somebody who needs to be controlled.
Sure.
So if a child is going to end up challenging the power of the abusing parent, even if it's something even if it's primarily between parents, then it definitely could, it's definitely something that could kind of roll over onto the children also.
Sure. So if a parent sees, I'm in this abusive relationship, what can they do for their child? Meaning they're on the receiving end, let's say. What can they do for their children as they see this happening? Like what would you say are like the action steps? Because you said it's about the support system. So is it like saying like, okay, let's go find you someone who could be your support system, or is it like what other action steps could they take at that time?
So I think it's a very hard thing to say. I think that the primary goal of anybody who's in that kind of position has to be their own personal safety. So the first thing that they can do for their child is figure out exactly what they want to do for themselves and figure out how to get it done.
Interesting.
In a way which is safe.
What do you mean by that? Meaning like taking care of their own safety first and foremost?
Meaning taking care of it, in a way, whether it's their emotional safety, whether it's getting their own support system.
It's like what they say on the airplane, like
yes,
put the
exactly.
thing on you before you put it on, right?
Just like making sure that figuring out exactly where they want to see themselves going, whether it's a matter of staying or going or having a plan, knowing how to navigate it for themselves in a way which works. I think it's in Yeshaya. He talks about how you have like a blind man flailing around in the dark. So why does it have to be a blind man if it's dark anyway?
Interesting.
So like the idea is that if it's a blind man and it's light, somebody else can help.
Right. Yeah.
The idea with this is that they have to be able to get themselves into a position where they have an idea of where they're going. They have to be able to navigate. And once they have that kind of stability for themselves, they can be a support system also, or they can contribute to a support system for their child.
Got it. Right. That makes sense. Would you say that it's better for, let's say, a parent to stay in an abusive relationship, to be able to have a partner? Meaning, I'm not saying for the parent's sake, for the child's sake. Is it better for a child, for the parent to stay in an abusive relationship? That way they have, two parents, the parent who's getting abused has a partner to raise the child with, or it's better to be raised by a single parent in a non-abusive relationship?
I would say that that's a case-by-case thing. Yeah.
Why? Why would that?
Because
I feel like some people listening would be like, isn't that obvious? So I'm curious, like, why would that be case by case?
So the reason that I would say that it's case by case is because we always want to allow the people who are being victimized, the people who are being abused, to make their own decisions based on whatever it is that they see in their relationship and how they want to navigate it. I mean, certainly there are definitely, like, it's very hard to say that, like, no, it's better for a child to stay in a relationship where there's abuse present. It's also hard to say that no, this child should be taken away from the parent. Like, every person knows what's best in their situation. It's just a matter of helping them to get to that. And being able to reach that stable point, to reach that point where they're doing what they feel is best and navigating that safely, obviously that has to take into account the children. And there may be some situations in which, yes, it is advisable to leave, or or they may feel that it's important for them to leave.
Right.
But I wouldn't say that it's a one size fits all answer.
Got it. Okay. Gotcha. What would you say are some important things for, this is a podcast for parents, right? So what would you say are some things that are important for parents to know that they should make sure, let's say, either for themselves to look out for, let's say with cues or with red flags like you spoke about before, within, let's say, that their child might be experiencing abuse, not necessarily in the home, right? Meaning, let's say, being abused by a teacher, a friend, or someone in their family, not in their immediate family, but in the extended family or in their community. What are some things that parents should be aware of, and some things that parents maybe should be even discussing with their children?
So I think there are a few things that I think are across the board are very important. One thing to keep in mind is, everybody talks about keeping open lines of communication with your child. So I'm going to jump on the bandwagon and say, keep open lines of communication with your child.
Right.
I will say that if you're just thinking about keeping open lines of communication with your child, when you start thinking like, I think something might be happening, then you're probably too late. So the idea of intentionally and mindfully creating a relationship in which your child feels like, I can talk to my parents about whatever it is that I want.
Is that something you focus on in workshops?
So it's something that we talk about. Yeah. One of the workshops actually that we do is it's a staff workshop, which we also do for parents. But the idea of creating that kind of a relationship, a non-judgmental relationship. And it's
so what do you discuss in that workshop? I mean, what's some actionable, I guess, advice or practical things that parents can say, okay, here's how I'm going to try to do that?
Okay, so the one thing that I think was like the first time I did this workshop was for a local yeshiva high school, and the reaction to this one piece is like people have their minds were blown. Teenagers are going to do what they want. That was it. They are going to do what they want. They are not going, like, they might ask your opinion, they might ask for your advice, but at the end of the day, they're capable of making their own decisions, and they are going to make their own decisions regardless of what it is. So when you're thinking about that, think about like your reaction to whatever their decided course of action might be. Is it actually going to make a difference? Sometimes maybe it will, but sometimes it won't.
Right. So you're saying be mindful of that as you react.
Being mindful.
Oh, you're saying in terms of creating that relationship.
Yes.
Meaning if you're going to overreact, then say, oh, forget it, I'm not even going to go talk to you about it in the first place.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Exactly. Like, there's the, if a child knows that their parent is going to be mindfully reactive, and that the parent is not going to be judgmental about the decisions that they're making, but is going to support them in making healthy decisions and give them whatever information that they think they need in order to make those decisions, they're much more likely to talk to parents about their concerns than they would be if the parent is just like coming in with an agenda and saying like, okay, well, this is the way we do it.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard this. I've heard my students say to me before, like, oh no, like my parents are chill. And what that really means, if you like reading between the lines, is like, I mean, not always, but usually what that means is they've spoken to their parents and their parents know, and like they're not jumping down their throats. They're not reacting in a crazy strong way. Yeah. They're like being understanding of them, and like that is the key. It sounds like what you're saying, right? Yeah,
exactly. You give them space to grow and to develop into their own person.
Sure.
Like we learn from making mistakes. That's like the best teacher is making mistakes.
Yeah.
So like let your kids make mistakes and be there to support them and help them out with that. So that's I think like just that's the top thing that I would say that's really important. And the idea of giving them that kind of space, it gives them that feeling of confidence and maturity. And I got that. The other thing that I would say that is super important is to understand like what's the reason that people don't talk about a lot of these things. And whether it's abuse or all the other issues that are rampant around societies that we're scared that our kids might run into these things. A lot of the reason that much of the reason that we don't talk about these things is because it's taboo, right? Because if you think about it, what does taboo mean? Taboo means we are socialized not to talk about these things.
Yeah.
It's like we just don't talk about that. It's the pink.
It's like we spoke about before, the keeping up and making sure that we fit into the normal standards and everything looks good. So it's like we shouldn't be talking about this. Like this is not something that's done in our.
That's a part of it. That's a part of it, and I think that there are many topics that could bear a lot more discussion that parents don't feel comfortable talking to their kids about because they themselves got this message of that this is taboo. This is not something to talk about. This is not something to discuss.
Oh, I mean, you're saying beyond that, it's like just like we want to look picture perfect, but more just like we don't talk about that.
Right.
We don't bring that up.
We don't talk about it. It's not something that we bring up. It's something that we're uncomfortable talking about. If you do end up having a conversation,
how can parents be more comfortable with it then? Because if they grew up feeling like, oh, this is taboo,
think about it. That's really what you do. I mean, parents like this is really getting into the relationship between parents to an extent, but like identifying exactly what it is that you want your kid to know about, and really figuring out exactly how to plan out a discussion in a way which is chilled, as you said, because like if you talk about something and you come across as like nervous and uptight, then the kid is going to get the message like, yes, these are the words you're telling me and thank you for giving me the vocabulary, but I'm also getting the message that this is not something you're comfortable talking about, and I'm not going to talk to you about it. So like really making a strong effort to have uncomfortable conversations with your kids.
In a comfortable way.
Right. Yeah, because that's how we make these things more comfortable. So it's like, if that's actually a big part of the idea of giving the vocabulary to the kids. We send home a letter to parents saying, this is the conversation that we're having with your kids. Please feel free to continue the conversation at home. We strongly encourage people to do that.
Right.
Because that's really where it comes from. Kids are going to be able to talk to us about things that we are able to talk to them about. So
that's such a great line.
Thank you.
I love that. That's very good.
The more comfortable we are or the more safe we make the space to have these kinds of uncomfortable conversations, the more likely it is that they'll come back to us with it.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. It's very true. What good marriage is good parenting, right? And therefore, children will learn how to resolve conflicts, how to cope with things, just in general, and like life, through what they see modeled in their home, through how they see their parents interacting. So a child who's growing up in this type of a home where there's, domestic violence, domestic abuse, how do they eventually learn these skills that they just were so, like you spoke about before, there's long-term effects and there's short-term effects. So like this is, like you said, they're going to get this, wrong, image of what relationships and roles and really, so how then does a child break out of that? And what role can parents do to help them?
So specifically for children who are growing up in an environment where you have abuse going on. So again, it comes back to their support system. And certainly we learn a lot from watching our parents, from watching how our parents model relationship skills, for better or for worse. And we also learn relationship skills from dealing with our peers. We learn relationship skills from dealing with our teachers, from our employers, from our employees, from our business partners, from pretty much everything.
Right.
We see what works and what doesn't. And one of the things that I mention in any of these workshops is that the basic dynamics of relationships are all the same. It doesn't matter if it's the cashier at 7-Eleven or your spouse. It's the same basic idea. Obviously, the spouse is hopefully a lot closer than the cashier.
Hope so.
Yeah, but it's the same basic idea that there are boundaries. There's a definition for what the relationship is. And those boundaries make it safe to conduct that relationship as it's supposed to be conducted. And the more healthy interactions a person has over the course of their lifetime, the more likely it is that they'll be able to duplicate those in closer relationships. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, marriage is a much more emotionally charged relationship. There's a lot more going on there. So it can be hard to do that, but it really all comes back to that support system of having a circle of people who are able to supply you with that experience of a healthy relationship.
Got it. And is that like, what would be the parents' first step in that case? Meaning, how do they establish that support system for their child, especially if they themselves are going through something that's so hard for them to, they're trying to get their own support system. And like you said before, first they have to take care of themselves, but they also want to try to take care of their child. So right. How is that reaching out to the school? Is it reaching out to, parents of their friends? What would
it might be.
Yeah.
It very well might be. And it depends really on what the person is comfortable with, mm-hmm. On what the comfort level of that person is and who they're willing to reach out to. But yes, definitely, people need support, and especially when they're going through such difficult times. The less isolated a person is, the more likely it is that they'll be able to navigate whatever it is that they need to navigate. So for themselves, being able to reach out to whatever support they need. For their child, being able to reach out for whatever support their child might need. Mm-hmm. That's all part of it.
Right. We spoke a little bit about, going to therapy, and like you said, the number one thing is to not tell them to go to couples therapy. So I'm curious, what would you say is the positive impact on the children when the couple not goes to therapy necessarily as couples therapy, but when they each either separately go to therapy or eventually make it back to what impact does that have on children? So
I mean, the impact of having parents who are successfully going to therapy, ideally, is that, and we're assuming that let's assume that both parents are going to therapy and they're working with their therapist and they're getting whatever it is done that they need to do. You're going to have more emotionally healthy parents. That's just off the top of it. You're going to have two parents who are, or even one parent who's a more emotionally healthy person. And even if the relationship between the parents is not ideal, then it's still giving the children more to look at mm-hmm. than would be the case if nobody was going to therapy, if nobody was getting any help. So that's one potential benefit of it. If they're able to improve the relationship, then you have all these wonderful things going on about modeling good relationship skills,
right,
about seeing how people repair after something terrible happening. And you see the positive relationship skills. You see the holding each other with positive regard. You see how they act with respect towards each other. You see how they act with honesty and accountability and responsibility towards each other. You see the acting on commitment towards each other. So like if you have people who are going to therapy, and this is not specifically an abusive,
right? This is just
in general. Like if you have
yeah.
people who are going to therapy and who are really doing the work that they need to do, then they're opening up a whole new chapter, a whole new book even, on what their children are going to be seeing.
Right. The reality is, the more healthy we are as individuals, the more healthy of a life we can give to our children.
Yes.
Because they're going to be not just the modeling, but just like their experience, their whole experience is going to be such a healthier experience.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Exactly.
Right. So I'm curious. We've been speaking a lot about so many different things. I'm curious, are there things that you would say the parents, either wouldn't know to ask about this, or just like things that wouldn't, that we wouldn't. I guess parents wouldn't know either to ask or that they need to know when thinking about this topic of, child safety and how they can best ensure their child safety, especially, through this lens.
So it's an interesting question. I mean, I think we were talking before about how parents, it's like you want to leave open lines of communication. You want to be able to, make sure that your kids are willing to talk to you. At the same time, it's like it's a balance you have to strike between being, the chilled out person who your kids feel totally comfortable schmoozing with,
right,
and being a parent. If we want to summarize what the role of a parent is with their child, the essential role of a parent is to, and this is across the board, to take a set of values and set the child up in a way that they're going to be living those values, to inculcate those values into the way the child lives their life.
Right.
And you can't do that by just being a chiller.
Right.
It's like it's not going to work. The only value you're going to get across by just being a chiller is that it's cool to be a chiller. Right. So you have to I just want to acknowledge that is definitely a struggle.
Right. It's a hard balance.
It's a very hard balance. It is. It can be very hard to walk that kind of a balance. Especially with like areas like these where it's like you don't want to step on their autonomy. On the other hand, they're about to do something really dumb. I think all parents have had moments like that, or even moments where they're kind of like scared about what their children might be up to, and they're not sure exactly how far to go.
Right.
I think that that's something that parents need to really put some thought into. I think one thing that can be helpful. It's like you don't want to make it seem like as a parent, you don't want to make it seem like you're letting your child do exactly whatever they want.
Sure.
So what I've seen that can work is putting out there how you feel about a certain issue and saying, you're going to make your own decisions, and I acknowledge that. This is what I feel is an important way to do it.
Got it.
And if the rest of your relationship is where it should be, they're going to take that seriously.
Sure.
And they may still end up making the decisions.
Like you said before, teens will do what they want to do.
Right. They're going to do what they want to do, and there's really no way to stop them. But putting out your viewpoint, presenting it as a valid viewpoint, while saying, okay, I understand where you're coming from also, that could be something. And in terms of protecting kids, it's just like having those conversations with them, just like being upfront about safety issues.
Right. So it seems like the best thing we, as a parent, can do, as a preventative, is to try to make them aware of what potential, red flags are. And what would you say some of those red flags might be?
So in relationships, being condescending. There's a line I heard once. It's like, I look down on condescending people, but it's a big deal.
Right.
If I see, like, let's say here, you have a young couple, they're out on a date, right? And they're treating each other very nicely. They're very polite, very cordial. The dating mask is very strongly in place, and you can tell that it's there, which is normal. I don't think anybody's themselves on a first or second or third or even fifth date. But then the waiter comes over and, delivers the wrong drink to the girl, and she snaps at the waiter, or the waiter's like late coming with like the dishes or something, gives him the wrong, and the guy says something not nice about him. So it's a red flag. It's something to pay attention to.
Right.
And the thing, like anger is another one. Like what if the person is angry? That's something to pay attention to.
Sure. Would you say the same type of things, let's say for like younger children, in terms of, the abuse that they might experience from an abusive friend or an abusive teacher? Like how would parents help protect their child from those types of things? And prevent, I guess, in a way also.
So, I mean, like part of it is definitely paying attention to, okay, so I guess in a preventative way from before the fact is, again, creating that kind of relationship with your kid that they're willing to discuss these things with you. And then there's just paying attention to seeing changes in their behavior, changes in how they present at home. What kind of reports are you getting from school, from teachers? Are you seeing academic changes and like just the way they're performing at school? Are you seeing emotional changes at home? Like, are they less interested in doing things that they might ordinarily be interested in doing? Just like paying attention, getting to know your kid.
Sure.
Getting to know your kid and understanding what their normal baseline is and understanding when they're not on that baseline for some reason. So just because a kid is like abnormally moody or has like mood swings that are, just not usually what he has, doesn't necessarily mean that there's abuse happening, but could mean that there's something happening. And as a parent, it's important to figure out what.
Right.
Figure out how that works, what's causing it, and how to alleviate it.
Got it. So first things first, try to see the red flags, see the cues. Okay. Next, you've seen some cues. What's the next step of a parent?
You've seen some cues. So give me a scenario here.
You notice that your child doesn't have the same appetite anymore. Let's say you're noticing that their grades are starting to slip in one particular class. Maybe the Rebbe or the teacher or whatever it is, let's say picking on them, and they're feeling like it's abuse. Or maybe they have a friend who's being really aggressive with them and controlling them and telling them, you have to do this, do my homework for me, you must, whatever it is, so then what does the parent do in that type of situation? And let's go with the assumption where the parent has established that type of relationship with their child where they're open. So they're telling them these things. They're telling them, I feel like this teacher's picking on me and I feel like, like the teacher told me I had to do this the other day and I felt really uncomfortable with it. Or my friend told me I had to do their homework for them. And why should I have to? And because you're starting to already pick up on there's something going on here. Right. So what then do you do?
So the question is really, what kind of support system do you have available to you? Let's go with the friend, I think, because that's like a lower hanging fruit here. Let's say you have a friend who you've identified, okay, this kid is now bullying my kid. So who can you get involved to intervene there? Could be it's a Rebbe, could be it's a teacher, could be it's a guidance counselor, or menahel, whatever it is. But there are people, hopefully, in the school who will be able to intervene and say, this is not something which is acceptable. This is not something which is acceptable, and to establish whatever protocols that they're going to establish. I know many schools have zero tolerance policies towards bullying, which is a great thing. It's like it can really send a message to both children who might be prone to bullying and potentially even to their parents, which is that this is just not going to fly. Right. It's not going to happen. Setting up and having a school culture which is anti-bullying, in which people understand, okay, bullying is not going to happen, and students are willing to stand up for each other in the face of bullying. I think that's a great thing.
Right.
When it's a teacher, obviously it's a little bit more complicated. But again, the question is, what kind of support system can you get in play to support your child and to make sure that this stops?
So it feels like the bigger theme that keeps coming up here is the support system.
Yes.
The best way to help protect your child and give your child, child safety in this area is really making sure that they either have a support system or helping them build up a support system.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's like one of the major things that we hear from victims of abuse and from bullying victims as well is that the part of the reason why it's so damaging is that it's just you're so alone.
Right.
You're so alone in all of this.
Well, that's where a hotline comes in and makes them feel like, at least I can, have
somebody to talk to.
Right.
But we've also seen that having a supportive community, having a community which is like vocally anti-abuse, or in school situations that are vocally anti-bullying, can make a huge difference.
Sure. Are there any other things that you'd say besides for the, the support system that a parent can do?
Other than the relationship and the support system, I would say that there's not a whole lot, but if you're doing those two right, then you're probably in pretty good shape.
Got it. Are there any, I guess, like you said before, having the language to be able to label it, are there any examples that you can give us of specific things that, parents should know or parents should be giving over to their children of make sure that your child knows these things so the way they could label it, either in terms of the abuse or the feelings, like what are some things?
So, and one of the things that we talk about when we talk about abuse is one of the big lines is trust your gut. That's that idea of acknowledging your feelings.
Right.
So we use that a lot. That's a big one. Speak to someone. The idea of saying to your kid, okay, and this comes up actually a lot when we talk about like shidduchim and dating and things like that. It's like, okay, I get that you don't always want to talk to your parents about your feelings.
Let's speak to someone.
Talk to somebody.
Right.
Find somebody you trust. Find somebody who you know has your best interests at heart.
Got it.
And that you can really be open to and really share the whole story with.
What are some things that are like good in terms of like labeling, like, okay, this is what's happening here? I mean, like you said before, like when they give the survey, sometimes they'll be like, now I know that this is what I was witnessing. This is what I was experiencing.
Just defining abuse, just defining what abuse is, that pattern of behavior, that of power and control.
Got it.
That's huge.
Got it.
That's huge. Another big thing, which I think doesn't really necessarily get as much airtime from places, with the idea of consent. The idea of consent, talking about consent. I was talking to a group of chassanim a couple of months ago, I think it was, and we came up to the idea. We were talking about the idea of consent, about being an active participant in making decisions in your relationship. And one of them says, like, what's consent? Like, it's such a foundational.
It's so crazy.
And listen, once I explained the concept, he understood the concept. But like having
that they should have the words. They should know what that is. They
having one word that can define. Okay, I'm an active participant, and I'm okay with this part of the relationship. I'm able to set up boundaries in my relationship, which is what consent is all about. So even if you don't want your kid like going around like, okay, I consent to this, I consent to that, which I guess, as a 5 or 6 year old would actually be pretty cute. But like just giving them the idea that there are some parts of their life that they do need to agree to.
Right. And they can say no.
Yeah. They can say no about certain things.
Right.
It's like we talk about, we're talking about child safety. Like that's one of the big things that we talk about, molestation and being abused like that, is that kids have to know that if anybody touches them in a way which makes them feel uncomfortable or touches them in a way that they shouldn't, they're allowed to say no. And if the person says you can't say no, you run, you go the other way. And that's really teaching kids about consent. So that concept of teaching consent, and again, it's something that you have to be able to do it very skillfully as a parent, because you don't want your kid saying, "I do not consent to bedtime."
Right.
That's a disaster.
Yeah.
But you have to give them that baseline of, okay, there are certain things that we need to have your permission for.
Right.
And that's
very
yours.
important. I know I'm totally putting you on the spot here. I'm curious. Has there ever been a crazy story that has happened to you in terms of giving a workshop or experience that would be helpful for parents to hear? Of like, wow, like that was crazy, and like this would just be eye-opening in a way.
So I mean, there like as I said, like there are those kids who would fill in, like on their survey, talking about how now they have the words to at least understand what's going on at home.
Sure.
I have one girl had filled out a survey saying something to the effect of, I always thought that this was just the way relationships were supposed to be.
Right.
And now I know that I have a choice, that I can make choices to chart my own course. I can make my own decisions, and I don't have to be stuck in this kind of relationship.
Right.
Which quite honestly, to an extent, that's also kind of consent. I do not consent to this kind of relationship.
Right.
And I'm going to make my own path. I'm going to do what feels right for me. Which is a tremendously empowering thing.
Totally.
There have been numerous cases where participants in workshops have come over to presenters afterwards. And we have a lot of different presenters who do this stuff. We have volunteer presenters who are very dedicated to this. They spend a lot of time, whether it's with the trainings that we do or with, driving or going out. But they've come over and they've said like, well, what if somebody would, and they'll outline like a story which is like, oh my gosh, And it's very obvious that they're talking about themselves.
Right.
You know, so it can be. I don't have anything off the top of my head,
That's
but
fine.
there are many stories like that.
For sure.
Yeah.
Do you have any final message? Any final message on this topic, and for parents that they should be aware of, or anything at all?
I think parents have to, first off, be willing to have uncomfortable conversations with each other.
Mm-hmm.
I think parents have to be willing to have uncomfortable conversations with their kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that they have to not give themselves such a hard time. It's like parents have to not give themselves such a hard time. Parenting it's quite honestly, it's the hardest job in the world.
Yeah.
It really is.
That's why we're developing a whole podcast, or dedicating a whole podcast for it.
You think about it. It's like, okay, let's say you have a stay-at-home mother, right? So the stay-at-home mother, maybe for the first few years of the kid's life, is around a little more often. They go off to school. How much one-on-one time does a parent have with their kid?
It's true.
Not a whole lot.
Yeah,
it's like you have like maybe 3, 4, or 5 hours. Part of that is homework, part of that is wrestling with the other kids and trying to make it so that, everybody at least has like something nominally to eat at night, and, just like logistics and, juggling relationships with your spouse and like all these different things that you have to juggle in life. And at the end of the day, you have this small miniature human being who's completely dependent on you, and they might not want to admit that they're completely dependent on you, depending on what age they are.
right.
But they are dependent on you, and your job is to make them into a functional, healthy human being who will be a member of a society that functions. And that's without getting into Yiddishkeit.
Right.
To inculcate into a child the hashkafas haTorah, the beauty of mitzvahs and everything. It's a lot of work.
Yeah,
it is a lot of work.
This whole entire podcast is being formulated based off of first and foremost it's based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs of first and foremost we got to deal with building a relationship with the child safety, and then and then emotional health, and then we can start working on the other things within their avodas Hashem and their Yiddishkeit. But we can't even get into that first before we deal with these things. Number one, and number two is that it's all based off of it's built in this program of that we use Gen Aleph, which is based on guiding good choices, which is a whole entire curriculum literally to help parents and to bond with their children and to help rates of attrition and all these things. That's like literally because parenting is hard.
Yeah,
parenting is very, very hard.
And I think parents have to kind of go easy on themselves.
I hear you.
It's like do the job and do the best you can, but understand that you're doing the best you can, and allow yourself to tell yourself that.
It's a good message. It's a good message.
Yeah, okay. And hopefully we'll all have good stuff.
Amen. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate so much wisdom here and so much great advice and nuggets to really great takeaways, and really, really, really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us for another episode as part of this series about child safety. This episode was really, really so crucial. This concept, this topic of domestic abuse is something that is really, it's unfortunately, as we heard the statistics from Yeshaya in the episode, it's really prevalent and it's scary. It's really scary. And it's something that we need to really make sure as a community to learn about and to study and to really make sure to put in the right, everything that Yeshaya was talking about to really prevent it. And one of the main things that Yeshaya spoke about that was my takeaway was this concept of support system, which is so crucial. Who is our children's support system going to be when, they need our help? When they need our help, or, if we're going through it, how can we be their support system? And that was really the whole idea of the episode. And I think one of the key takeaways was the fact that, and he put it so well, that kids are going to do what they're going to do anyways. So it's really about how do we react? And they're not going to change what they necessarily do because of how we react. It's more just, it's going to change how they relate to us because of how we react. And the first topic that we spoke about was all about building a relationship with one's child, because that is really such a crucial thing to parenting. If we have that relationship, then we're gold. We can do really anything from there. As long as we have that baseline, which is why it was the first topic, as long as we have that baseline of having a strong relationship, and our children know that they can rely on us, then we can prevent so many of these things and all these issues within child safety. We spoke about with technology and with child abuse and really all of the different topics, the bullying, also everything. As long as our children have this great relationship with us, we're going to be in such a better place. I hope you'll join us back for another amazing episode next week with Stephen Hill, where he tells us his story. I mean, it's going to be a very powerful story. I'm really excited to share it with you. You're not going to want to miss this episode. It's going to be super powerful, and really excited. We actually have a special guest joining us, which is actually his father, to talk about what it was like to parent during that experience and what maybe he could have done differently and what we can learn from that whole entire story. I'm super excited to share it with you next week. So without further ado, have a great week, and I look forward to seeing you back here next week.